DxO PureRAW version 4 is out today, assuming I got the embargo date correct. We can but hope. And if you don't know what PureRAW is, it's a piece of software used to improve your RAW photos. So it's not an all-in-one photo editor, something like Lightroom, for example. Instead, it's largely automated, and the idea is that you give it a RAW photo, and it gives you a better RAW photo at the end, which you can then continue on to edit in your chosen software. It applies a bunch of different corrections, things like denoising, demosaicing, and a bunch of optical corrections to give you a better base to start from. Its denoising in particular is something that you can compare against other software, but the rest of it is a little bit different, whereas things like Topaz tend to do subject-based sharpening. So, for example, with birds, it attempts to sharpen the bird. DxO corrects for lens flaws. So if you have more problematic gear, maybe you're using older equipment, maybe you're using a lens that isn't quite the best, those sorts of things, DxO PureRAW can be very beneficial, and it gives more life to older cameras as well, or more flexibility to somebody like me who shoots at very high ISOs a lot of the time. I like being able to shoot at high ISOs because it gives you so many more options in lower light situations, and somewhere like Wales where it is typically quite dark. So lots of my photos tend to be taken at quite high ISOs, and when you take 10,000 photos in a day, and I obviously don't know any idiot who would do such a thing, but it can be very difficult to look at those photos and to see how good they are. If they're all shot at ISO 25,600, well, it's just a wall of noise. You have no real idea which is the good photo. So being able to automate processing them and getting a better version is very good. I had versions 1 and 2 of PureRAW, but I skipped version 3, and I made a video about why last year, although it's a little bit out of date. DxO themselves actually saw that video, put aside the fact that I called their software a bit weird, and this year they've given me early access to it so I can make this video for the embargo date. Now, they've supplied me with a license for the beta copy of the software, but that license expires on the embargo date. They've not paid me in any way, and they have no oversight on what I say in this video. But I do have some affiliate links down below. If you are thinking of buying the software, then I may get a commission if you use those links in order to buy it. But let's go and have a look at some of my test photos. We're not going to go through a huge amount of them, but we are going to go through a few more normal ones, and then one in particular that I'm very excited about the improvement in it, made possible via the new Deep Prime XD2 denoising model in version 4 of PureRAW. So let's go and have a look. So let's get started by adding some photos in. I've got 5 test photos that we're going to have a look at. And we're going to start with a picture of a sparrow. First bug alert. When I pick a picture and choose process with preview, it just gives me a different picture to start, which is kind of weird. We're going to start with this picture of a sparrow. Now, this was taken on the OM1. This is taken at ISO 25,600. And I don't remember this photo, but it's quite a good example photo because it provides a good example of what these photos can look like. So it's largely in focus. You can see quite a lot of moire around the feathers chest area of the bird. You can see that its left eye is actually slightly out of the focal plane. This is something that I would brush in manually with sharpening rather than expecting DxO to resolve this, because it's fixing lens sharpness issues, not me focusing wrong sharpness issues, if that makes sense. So particularly on birds, the Nikon Z9 is a particularly guilty camera for this, in that it tends to focus on the cheeks of birds. And so what I tend to do is I use a brush mask and I sharpen the eye slightly behind it to bring it back into focus. Now, if we look over on the right, you can see some more options. So we're going to use Deep Prime XD2. I believe the XD thing will be removed on the retail version. I think this is just the debugging version available beforehand. And looking under optical corrections, we can see a bunch of the defaults. However, I do change the lens softness option from standard down to soft, and I'll show you why in a second. So looking at the preview, the default settings for this have done a very, very nice job of cleaning up all this color noise. The background looks fantastic, and particularly the feather detail on the bird. It's done a really nice job. There's no artifacting that I can see in here. The fact that it's found so much sensible feather detail and inferred what should be there and done a very good job of it is very impressive. But here's where you can see the difference in the sharpening. So if you have it set to soft, I like the default sharpness, but standard is over sharp to my taste. Hopefully this comes through YouTube's compression. I'm not entirely certain. Just as an example, if I set it to hard, you can see it's very sharp. That's far too sharp for me. And I like it set to soft. When it's turned off entirely, it's maybe a little bit too soft. So I do like to have a little bit of sharpening in it. And it does a very nice job. So I'm pleased with that preview, and we can process it. Now, my computer only takes about 10 seconds to process one of these files. It's quite powerful. It's got an NVIDIA 3080 Ti graphics card in it, and your results and speed will obviously vary based on how powerful your graphics processor is in your computer. Let's take a look at the results. So I'm very pleased with that, and it's done a brilliant job of cleaning up things like the grain in the wood. That's very, very good. There's no excessive sharpening, haloing, or anything like that. It's just a very, very good base level of photo. So I'm very pleased with the effects of that. Now, next up, we're going to try a photo of a mammal. This is on the Nikon Z9 instead, and this is a photo of a bird because it's gone to the wrong photo again. This is a photo of a deer, and looking at the preview, it's doing a very nice job of dealing with this deer. Now you can actually see that this photo is probably not perfectly sharp again on the head. I think that the sharpness, like the focal plane, is very slightly behind the head. I don't think it's motion blur. And this is something that you could potentially improve by turning up the sharpness profile on a DxO. But again, I'd probably brush it in manually later. So I'm going to leave it set to soft again. I think it's done a very nice job, and we're going to process it first and then have a look a little bit more in detail, because this photo has a lot going on. Lots of very fine fur detail and a busy background and a busy foreground too. There's a lot of grass on the floor. So let's take a look. Now, this was taken on the Z9, but with the Sigma 150 to 600, and you can see that it has actually changed some perspective of it. It's fixed some distortion in the lens, and it's done a nice job of it. And when we zoom in, I think it's done a wonderful job of fixing up the fur and getting it looking very, very realistic. It's done a nice job there. And even down into the grass with dew on it, it's done a really, really nice job of cleaning it up without over sharpening it, without generating artifacts. So one of the problems that a lot of denoising or AI denoising software has is that fixing the directions of things like blades of grass and stuff, sometimes you get random other bits going the other way or things like that. This doesn't seem to be susceptible to that. It's doing a really, really nice job, and I'm very pleased with that. This being a high resolution file, I can then stick this in Lightroom and crop in a bit more to get a good image out of it. But next we go to my favorite image, and one that has been a nightmare for all of these pieces of software, including previous versions of DxO PureRAW, and that is the same photo of a swallow. Now, what we want is this photo of a wagtail. And if you're wondering why I find so many bugs in things, it's because I am a software engineer and also cursed when it comes to computers. So I find them by default, and I have reported these to DxO. So they will hopefully be fixed either for launch or shortly after. But you can see the base photo of this. This is an ISO 25600 again on the OM1, and there was a very limited amount of light left at this point. It was at sunset. It was in a dark area on a river. The bird was backlit. Everything that could possibly go wrong. It also had to be taken at 1/4000th of a second because the bird is so fast. And I was trying to catch it flapping up and catching bugs in the air. And I caught it but the photo looks like this. And this has frustrated me for the last 2 years since I took this photo. Previous versions of PureRAW and indeed Topaz and Adobe AI denoise have a lot of problems with this photo for a few different reasons. Number one, the texture of these two center feathers here is very different. The colors in particular, it looks much more faded, and they get confused about what should be in the middle and they think it's transparent. It also, due to the blue color noise around here, tends to leak out. The color leaks out of those feathers when it's processed. There are small elements on the wings up here which are really just semi-translucent feathers, but they think are holes in the feathers, and that's not the case. There's a lot of very tiny insects, and I can't even tell the shape of some of these insects. That one's fairly clear, but no idea about this one. It's very, very noisy, unfortunately. The biggest problem tends to be in this area down here where the water is. Now, this is caused by this being in the focal plane and the other bits going in and out of focus. It causes a lot of problems for the denoising software because it's looking for textures and trying to infer what the ripple should look like. But it causes a lot of problems. And so for a comparison, before I show you how this one comes out, take a look at this one done in Lightroom. So this is done using Lightroom AI denoise. And looking down in the water, you can see that it's generating artifacts in this area. This is something that is consistently problematic. Equally with this version generated in PureRAW version 3. You can see it couldn't quite deal with this photo, but version 4 is much improved. So we're going to keep the same settings again, and we're going to process that. And we're going to take a look and see what it's able to improve. It's a huge improvement. There's still a bit of a lack of detail in the bird, and as you can see, like previous versions, it has gotten confused a little bit here and thought that there's just a hole in the tip of the wing, but it's prevented the tail from bleeding, and it's got a very nice even color down the tail feathers, which all the previous versions have failed at. There's maybe a little bit of an oddity going on here with some wings being blurred, but for most of the insects, it's done a very good job of detecting their shape. I'm particularly impressed with these ones here. And the water texture is great. It's a really realistic set of water ripples. It hasn't got that sort of weird painterly effect. It's not put any artifacting into it. It's a huge improvement. And I'm very, very pleased with this photo. Now I can stick this into Lightroom, and I can finish tweaking it to bring out the colors, because RAW files are typically quite dull colors in the first place. And this is the final version up on the screen now. So yes, very, very pleased. But now let's break it. Let's give it a photo. This is a nightmare for these pieces of software, and that is the one that has been trying to show you the preview of all this time. That is this photo of a swallow. So these bits of denoising software, when they're trying to find detail in the photo to interpret, to infer, to put it in where it isn't, to make it look like it's a lower ISO photo, just invent things. And this photo is a nightmare, and it's still a problem in this version of Deep Prime XD as well. But you do have an option now, in that in this version of PureRAW, you can actually adjust some of the parameters given to the denoising model, and that can have an interesting effect. So we're going to generate this twice, and so to start with, we're going to have a look at how it looks by default. So these are the default settings with force details set to 0. And if we zoom in so we get a higher quality version of it, you can see a lot of weird stuff going on in here. A lot of texture that should not exist. We're going to process it, and we're going to take a look and see. And then I'm going to reprocess it, but I'm going to change those parameters. So yes, as you can see, there's a lot of odd texture in this that really shouldn't exist. This is something I've noticed with all AI denoising software. Lightroom does this as well, and here's an example. This is the same photo put through it. And it seems to be something that's somewhat consistent across the various bits of software. But in the new version of PureRAW, you do have an option, which is, if we go back into Process with Preview, and this time we do actually want to see this photo, so that's okay. We're going to zoom in a bit and look at some of this texture. But we can now go to the Advanced tab, and we can drop Force Details down. So Force Details is where it's trying to infer the details. And I've already run this through once, so I know that the only setting that works is to take it out entirely. And we're going to do that. But we want the bird in the shot as well. So when you take the details out, the bird is going to be blurrier. It's not going to have as much detail there, but that's because the detail doesn't exist in the first place. It's sort of creating it. So we drop it to -100. The bird is now blurry, but on the upside, the background looks pretty good. So we're going to run that through the processor now, and it's still not going to be perfect, but this isn't a perfect photo. The subject is too small, really, for the amount of noise in the photo. And we'll have a look at another example shortly that is in extremely similar conditions, but much larger in the frame. So as you can see, even with that setting applied, it still looks a little bit unnatural. It has fewer of those clumps, but there's still some odd patterning going on, unfortunately. This is a photo that is just quite problematic. But if we take a look at a similar set of conditions in a photo, we're going to have a look at a duck that was in a previous video of mine. And this duck is much larger in the frame. We've got a lot more detail in the bird to begin with, and therefore when we're denoising, it's got more to work with, more detail to use to figure out what the rest of it should look like. And as you can see, the duck is nice and sharp, very sharp around the face and on the feathers. The background is absolutely full of rain. And if we go in and we set it back to the defaults, it oh, that's annoying. Set it to 0. Right. When we go back and we have a look at it, it's done a really, really nice job of picking out the detail on this bird. Got a lot of feather detail on the wing over here and a lot on the chest. It's done a fantastic job of clarifying how that bird should look. It's also not caused too much by way of artifacting in the background. I think there's a little bit down here that's a little bit odd, but again, that's something that I'll just clone out in Lightroom later. The vast majority of it is looking really good. So let's process that and take a look at the final rendered version. Apparently I've selected multiple photos and it's processing them all. So here's the final rendered version of this photo, and I'm very, very pleased with the results. There's actually even a fly in the upper right hand corner of this photo that I don't recall ever seeing before, so that was a discovery. I'm very pleased with this, and then I can take this into Lightroom and apply my finished edits. So I'll probably get rid of these branches over on the left and crop it in somewhat as well. It is thankfully on the Z9 and therefore quite high resolution. And this is the final photo on the screen now. And that's it for my preview of DxO PureRAW version 4. In general, I'm very pleased with the results, particularly that Wagtail photo. That is a huge improvement for me to be able to finally use that photo. I've loved it for a long time, but known that it wasn't quite right. So now finally having a version that looks how I remember that scene is very satisfying to me. There's a bit of a summary of the changes in this version, just because I haven't covered all of them in this video. The major change is Deep Prime XD2, which does replace Deep Prime XD in the retail version of the software. The base XD version will no longer exist. Do keep in mind though that if you're a Fujifilm X-Trans sensor user, so if you use a crop sensor Fujifilm camera, that you probably don't want to upgrade just yet. Support for the X-Trans sensor is not shipping at launch. It's going to be added later on in a few months, as far as I know. This is because they're fundamentally different and take more time, or probably the same amount of time, but a different amount of time compared to Bayer sensors. They can't do them with the same setup. They are fundamentally different. They've also added some changes to the lens softness corrections, and as you've seen, I tend to turn those down to the soft setting, but I like it on the soft setting. That's a good default for me, for my use case, and I'm happy to leave that and to automate most of my photos through with that as the default. The rest of the changes are largely workflow based. So rather curiously, they've added some new batch processing features, a batch renaming feature. That's quite rare these days. For some reason, batch processing has kind of gone out of vogue with software makers, and that's frustrating for idiots who I obviously don't know who take 10,000 photos in a day. It's something that is very, very nice to have, and it can save you a lot of time. On the subject of saving time, they have improved the speed of the Lightroom plugin quite significantly, and that's a very nice upgrade because that did used to quite annoy me. They haven't yet fixed the other thing about the plugin that I find annoying, which is that it seems to have to insert your photos into a collection when re-importing them. There doesn't seem to be any way to disable that. I really wish there was. I find that very infuriating. And for that reason, I'll probably go back to processing separately in PureRAW first and then importing them into Lightroom. They've also added a new widget, as they're calling it, which allows you to auto-detect when a memory card full of photos is inserted, launch PureRAW and start working on them. That's a nice feature. All those sorts of things can be really beneficial for people who are processing a lot of photographs. So in terms of pricing, it's €119, $119 or £109 for a new license, or it's €79, £69 for an upgrade license. And I believe there is a free trial available. There always has been in the past, but obviously the updated website isn't available just yet. Go and give it a go. Just on the free trial, let me know how you get on. I'd be really interested in knowing how it works for your photos. Are you an astrophotographer in Antarctica? Obviously, I want to know that I have a viewer in Antarctica. That's very, very exciting. But also, I'd be curious to know how it works for your photos too. Is it something that works better for birds or for space? I don't know. But I would be curious to know your thoughts. Or if you find other pieces of software better for your use case, please do put your comments down below. I do read them all. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time.